Welcome to lecture number 30. In lecture number 29, we discussed the concept of standard cost. And at the end of the lecture, we discussed the difference between the standard cost and the cost that was actually incurred. And we call that difference variance. Now, we also discussed that the difference can be of two types. Either it can be a favorable is when your standard is uh, less than actual, or it can be adverse is when the total amount that you actually incurred is more than the standard cost that you should have incurred. So there are two types of variances: unfavorable and favorable. Now we will discuss this concept of variance in detail with respect to direct materials, direct labors, and manufacturing overhead. So we discussed that when we computed the um, total material cost, we figured out that the difference was 3,000 and the actual cost was in fact greater than the standard cost. Now, analyzing and reporting variances from standards, if you remember, we also did that. We made a small chart and we were able to calculate the total variance figure. Now, let's discuss the direct material variance in detail. We already know that the direct material variance can be because of two factors. One factor is the difference in the price, and the other factor is the difference in the quantity that was used. Part of Zonic's total variance of 3000 is due to materials variance as we calculated in illustration 23.9. In completing the order for 10,000 gallons of Zonic tonic, the company used 4,200 pounds of direct material. The direct material was purchased at a price of $3.1. Now, what they have done is they have given us the amount, the quantity that was used as direct material, and the price at which it was purchased as well. From illustration 23.3, we know that Zonic standards require it to use 4 pounds of material per gallon produced, so it should have only used 4,000 pounds of direct materials to produce 1,000 gallons. As per the standard cost, you should they should have used 4 pounds per unit, and what they did, they used more than that. In fact, they used 4.2, so the figure should have been 4. So the standard cost in this scenario should have been 4,000. Instead it was 4,200. Illustration 23.2 shows that the standard cost of each product of direct materials is $3 instead of the 3 actually paid. It means the material should have been bought at the price of $3. Instead, it was bought at $3.10. So per unit, 10 cents was additionally paid, which shows that the actual um, cost was in fact greater than the standard cost. Illustration 23.12 shows that the total material variance is computed as the difference between the amount paid. So what is the amount paid? Actual quantity times actual price. Because you see, material has two characteristics attached to it. One is the price, एक जिस कीमत पे आपको खरीद रहे हैं, और दूसरा quantity, जितनी quantity आप material की use कर रहे हैं in order to make your products. So the total material variance is actual quantity into actual price minus standard quantity into standard price. इन दोनों को when you calculate, इन दोनों का जो difference है, that determines the variance, whether the variance is unfavorable or the variance is favorable. In this scenario, we can see that the variance is unfavorable. Why? Because the actual quantity into actual price is greater than standard quantity into standard price. Thus, for Sonic, the total materials variance is 1020, which is 13,020 minus 12,000. 13,020 you will get when you multiply actual quantity with actual price, and 12,000 is the standard cost related to material, which is calculated by multiplying standard quantity, which is 4,000, into standard price, which is $3 per unit. The total material variance could be caused by difference in the price paid for the material. आपको पता है, if you buy at a price which is different from the standard price, so obviously आपका variance या there will be some sort of a change in the uh, material total material variance, or by differences in the amount of material used. अगर let's say for a product standard says that we should use 5 pounds of raw material, or if and instead of 5 pounds if you use 4.5 pounds, so you will have a variance of 0.5 pound. So जो आपका material variance होता है, that can be because of the price, or it can also be because of the quantity that was used. Illustration 2313 shows the total materials variance is the sum of the materials price variance and the materials quantity variance. So one is your material price variance, कि जो actual price और जो standard price है, what was the difference in that, और उसमें आप ऐड करते हैं materials quantity variance, what quantity should have been used and what quantity was actually used. So जब आप उन दोनों को ऐड करेंगे, so you will get the total material variance. The materials price variance results from a difference between the actual price and the standard price. Illustration 2314 shows that the materials price variance is computed as the difference between the actual amount paid, actual quantity of materials times actual price, and the standard amount that should have been paid. Standard amount that should have been paid वो amount होता है when you are determining the standard price, the standard cost. At that time, you determine the standard quantity which should have been paid for. Assume that all materials purchased during the period are used in production and that no units remain in inventory at the end of the period. Why you assume that? Because you assume that all the material that was purchased has been consumed in production. So there is nothing pending in the inventory. So it shows that जो कुछ आपने raw material खरीदा था, उस raw material को आपने consume किया in order to make your products. So now what is the formula for material price variance? Remember, जो आपका total material variance है, it has two components. One is the material price variance and one is the material quantity variance. So in order to calculate the total materials variance, we will always have to use two formulas. One will calculate the material price variance and the second formula will calculate the materials quantity variance. Now we will discuss the formula for material price variance. The formula is actual quantity into actual price minus actual quantity into standard price. So इसमें you should know three things. You should know the actual quantity, actual price, and standard price. And why we should know the actual quantity and actual price? Because we are doing the material price variance. Price may we look at the कीमत, we look at the amount that was paid and the amount that should have been paid. That is why whenever we talk about material price variance, आपको actual quantity के साथ साथ एक्चुअल प्राइस और स्टैंडर्ड प्राइस दोनों रिक्वायर्ड होंगी. So material price variance में you need actual price and standard price with actual quantity. So when we use this formula, आपको पता है actual quantity was 4200 और आपने कितना में परचेज किया था, $3.10. उसमें से आप सब्ट्रैक्ट करते हैं actual quantity into standard price I have told you is $3. So इससे जो आपका रिजल्ट आता है which shows whether the variance was favorable or unfavorable. तो हम देखते हैं कि आपका $420 अनफेवरेबल था। इसका मतलब है कि जो प्राइस आपने एक्चुअली पे की दैट वाज $420 more than what should have been paid. As seen in illustration 2313, the other component of the material variance is the quantity variance. आपने material price variance calculate कर ली. Now you have to calculate material quantity variance. As shown in illustration 2315, the material quantity variance is computed as the difference between the standard cost of the actual quantity. अच्छा, now how do you calculate the standard cost of the actual quantity? वो actual quantity times standard price आता है, and standard cost of the amount that should have been used. So standard quantity times standard price. Now we will try to uh, disintegrate this formula. Remember, we are calculating formula for materials quantity variance. So what we are trying to calculate? We are trying to calculate the material quantity variance. Material quantity variance means कि कितनी quantity में कितनी मकदार में raw material was used. So whenever we are dealing with material quantity variance, so you should always have the actual quantity and the standard quantity. So when you talk about quantity variance, you should have actual quantity and standard quantity. When you talk about price variance, you should have the actual price versus standard price. So for material quantity variance, actual quantity into standard price minus standard quantity into standard price. इनका जो भी difference आएगा, that will show you the variance, whether the variance is favorable or it is adverse. आप इसमें देते हैं $600 का unfavorable variance आया. It means the actual quantity that was used is more than the standard quantity that should have been used. Thus, for zoning, the material quantity variance is 600 unfavorable. The quantity variance can also be computed by applying the standard price to the difference between actual and standard quantities used. The computation in this example is $3 into 4200 minus 4600. The total material variance of 1020 therefore consists of the following. Material price variance आपकी 420 unfavorable थी, material quantity variance 600 unfavorable था, तो जो आपका total material variance है वो 1020 डॉलर unfavorable है. It means when we were dealing with the materials, हमारा price और quantity का the total variance was 1020 unfavorable. Companies sometimes use a matrix to analyze a variance. When a matrix is used, a company computes the amount using the formulas for each element first and then computes the variance. Now, how do you use this matrix? You know कि जो आप what you do initially you calculate your price variance and at the same time you calculate your quantity variance. तो आप देखेंगे price variance का we already know the formula and where is the formula for material price variance वो ये है. You use that formula, उससे you get this figure minus 420 unfavorable. Then you do the quantity variance. ये जो आता है इन दोनों को when you add you get the total material variance और total material variance को as one formula में insert करके भी you can calculate it both ways. You will get the same answer. So what you have to do whenever you are dealing with variances is remember these formulas. When you know the actual quantity, standard quantity, actual price, standard price, all you have to do is use these formulas, insert values into these formulas, and you will get the variance. And using the figure that you derive, you should be able to figure out whether it is favorable or it is unfavorable. Now, what are the causes of material variances? What are the causes of a variance? The causes may relate to both internal and external factors. The investigation of a material's price variance usually begins in the purchasing department. Now, why does it begin in the purchasing department? उसकी वजह है कि purchasing department is the one which is responsible for buying the raw material. So when you look at the uh, uh, परचेजिंग डिपार्टमेंट, तो आपको ये इमीडिएटली यू कैन फिगर आउट कि क्या क्वांटिटी परचेज की गई थी, नंबर वन, किस वैल्यू पे क्वांटिटी परचेज की गई थी, व्हाट वाज द कॉस्ट व्हेन यू वर बाइंग इट, and number three factor, which is very very important to keep in mind, is the quality of the raw material. आया जो आपने raw material purchase किया था, it was of good quality or not? Because remember, if the raw material is poor, you will always end up using raw material to produce your products. Why? क्योंकि उसमें आपकी wastage or spoilage is always greater when the raw material is of poor quantity. Many factors affect the price paid for raw materials. These include availability of quantity and cash discounts, the quality of materials requested. अब आपने ये देखा है कि maybe the price that was paid for raw material was less because the material was of poor quality. So now you have to figure out कि इस scenario में if you end up saving dollars in form of paying less, does it do you any good? Because remember, the product that you ended up buying is of poor quantity. To the extent that these factors are considered in setting the price standard, the purchasing department is responsible for any variance. However, a variance may be beyond the control of the purchasing department. Sometimes, for example, prices may rise faster than expected. Moreover, actions by groups over which the company has no control. For example, when you talk about oil, you know कि ऑयल की जो प्राइसेस हैं वो सेट होती हैं ओपेक कंट्रीज के थ्रू. अगर आपका रॉ मटेरियल एक ऑयल है, इट इज अ वेरी इंपॉर्टेंट रॉ मटेरियल ईंधन, एंड सडनली इट्स price goes up, now that is beyond the control of the purchasing department. So you always have to investigate in order to uh, find out exactly what happened, and always make sure you investigate thoroughly before putting blame on any department or any manager. The starting point for determining the causes of a significant material quantity variance is in the production department. If the variances are due to inexperienced workers, faulty machinery or carelessness, the production department is responsible. अब आप देखते हैं material quantity variance में you देखते हैं कि you ended up using more raw material than what should have been used. तो हो सकता है आपके inexperienced workers हों, आपकी machinery faulty हो, maybe it is leading to a lot of wastage or an inefficient production, or carelessness हो सकती है because the labor that was controlling the machinery was, you know, maybe not up to the mark and they did not do their job properly. So ये तमाम factors you should always investigate and consider when you're determining the reasons behind any variance. Now we have done the direct material variance. We know direct material variance has two components. One is the price component and the other one is the quantity component. We do the direct labor variance in exactly the same way. The process of determining the direct labor variance is the same as for determining the direct material variance. In completing the zonic tonic order, the company incurred 2100 direct labor hours at an average hourly rate of 14.8. So when we look at this statement, हमें पता लग जाता है कि when we talk about labor, like material, it will always have two aspects or two, you can say, shades to it. एक तो आपका होगा जो total number of hours that were used, total labor की कितने hours लगे थे और as a standard कितने लगने चाहिए थे. That is one part of the story. The second part is कि labor का hourly rate कितना होना चाहिए था and what did we end up paying the labor for their work. So like direct material variance, direct labor variance also has two parts. Now it has given us the standard direct labor hour. इसने हमें ये बता दिया है कि what was the standard labor rate, which as we can see is $15 per hour. The total labor variance is the difference between the amount actually paid for the labor versus the amount that should have been paid. Illustration 2318 shows the total labor variance is computed as the difference between the amount actually paid for the labor and the amount that should have been paid. Okay, when we talk about total labor variance, just like we did total material variance, so whenever we talk about total labor variance, so using the one formula, we can figure out the total variance in labor. So the formula for total labor variance is actual hours into actual rate जो आपका एक्चुअली आपके घंटे लगे थे टू प्रोड्यूस एंड जो एक्चुअल लेबर इन फॉर्म ऑफ वेजेस एंड सैलरीज आपने पे की थी माइनस स्टैंडर्ड आवर्स इनटू स्टैंडर्ड रेट व्हिच इज द स्टैंडर्ड दैट शुड हैव बीन incurred. So you get total labor variance which is unfavorable as we can see. The total labor variance is 1080 when you subtract these two figures. Unfavorable. The total labor variance is caused by difference in the labor rate or difference in labor hours. Now we know that there is a variance in the total labor that was incurred. Now we have to go into the detail and try to figure out कि वो जो आपका variance exist करता है, is it because of the labor price or is it because of the labor quantity? Labor price is what at which rate was the labor hired, and labor quantity variance labor quantity is how much hours did the labor put in doing that work. The labor price variance results from the difference between the rate paid to the workers versus the rate that was supposed to be paid. So you can see ये आपका what it is doing. It is comparing the actual figure with the standard figure. Illustration 2320 shows that the labor price variance is computed as the difference between actual amount paid. Obviously, when we talk about actual amount paid, so that will be actual hours times actual rate. और जो आपका labor price variance में second part है. Now remember we are doing the price aspect of labor. So whenever we are doing the price aspect of labor, so standard rate आपका जो actual hours हैं वो तो same रहेंगे. लेकिन जो आपका चेंज होगा वो एक्चुअल रेट और स्टैंडर्ड रेट होगा. So the formula is actual hours into actual rate minus actual hours into standard rate. Why? Because we are calculating the labor price variance. इससे आप देखते हैं आपका फेवरेबल आया 420. फेवरेबल 420 को आप इंटरप्रेट ऐसे कर सकते हैं कि जो टोटल wages and salaries आपने लेबर को पे की that was $420 less than what should have been paid. The other component of the labor total labor variance is the labor quantity variance. The labor quantity variance results from the difference between the actual number of labor hours and the number of hours that should have been worked for the quantity produced. Illustration 2321 shows that the labor quantity variance is computed. Now यहाँ पे आप देखेंगे we have calculated labor price variance. We know every variance has two part. One is the price part and then you have the quantity part. So for labor part, we have looked at the labor price variance. Now we look at the labor quantity variance. What is labor quantity variance? कि लेबर ने कितने घंटे इस्तेमाल किए और कितने घंटे लेबर को लगाने चाहिए थे as per the standard. So the formula is actual hours into standard rate minus standard hours into standard rate. आप देखेंगे इस फॉर्मूले में standard rate is the same. Why standard rate is the same? Because we are calculating labor quantity. So whenever we are calculating the difference in the labor quantity or the variance in the labor quantity, so we will always take the actual hours that were used and the standard hours that should have been used. Thus for government the labor quantity variance is आप देखते हैं it is 1500 अनफेवरेबल है. तो इससे हमें पता लगता है कि जो आपका लेबर क्वांटिटी वेरिएंस है वो 1500 अनफेवरेबल है और जो आपका लेबर प्राइस वेरिएंस था वो 420 फेवरेबल था. इसी को अगर आप या आप इसमें कैलकुलेट करेंगे टोटल लेबर वेरिएंस में, so it will give you the same answer. Why? Because it is 420 favorable, it is 1500 unfavorable. So when you can subtract 420 from 1500, you will get 1080, which will be unfavorable. Why? Because the unfavorable calculation is bigger than the favorable calculation. ये reason है, ये logic है behind figuring out whether it is unfavorable or it is favorable. When you individually collect these, calculate these two, तो जो unfavorable अगर बड़ा होगा तो obviously the net result will be unfavorable. The total direct labor variance of 1080 therefore consist of, आपका 1080 कैसे आया था, आप लेबर प्राइस वेरिएंस फेवरेबल थी 420 और आपकी टोटल लेबर क्वांटिटी वेरिएंस अनफेवरेबल थी 1500 की. Same as direct material, you can use the matrix to calculate the direct labor variance, which has the same flow and which has the same conceptual calculations attached to it. Now, what are the causes of labor variance? Labor price variances usually result from two factors: paying workers different wages than expected and misallocation of workers. In companies where pay rates are determined by union contracts, labor price variances should be infrequent. Up now, when we talk about causes of labor variance, we have to look at the misallocation of workers. Misallocation of workers can have two different aspects. One aspect is at some places you need skilled labor. अगर skilled labor की जगह if you use a labor which is not skilled, तो obviously आपकी inefficient production होगी, उससे आपकी wastage हो सकती है, labor hours increase हो सकते हैं. इसका second aspect है, we know that skilled labor will always uh, take more salary and wages than a labor which is less skilled. बहुत से places में you need people with very limited skill to do it. उन places में if we use skilled labor, so we will end up paying more in form of wages and salaries than we should be paying. So this is one aspect. The other aspect is efficiency of workers. Worker जितना efficient होता है, obviously उतनी कम wastage होगी, उतनी ज़्यादा productivity होगी. In this case, productivity means how many units can you produce, let's say, in 1 hour. So that is one way to define the productivity of any labor. For this, it is necessary to look at the, the ethics of production department, how they are working. Then we should also look at care personal decisions. Aya the allocation of labor was correct, incorrect थी, तो what led to that decision and what were the consequences of that decision. Now we look at the manufacturing overhead rate. We already know manufacturing overhead rate may, we always, if you remember when we were doing the job order costing, uh, in fact, we did the same activity-based costing, that you have a predetermined rate. You calculate, okay, this much cost manufacturing in form of manufacturing overhead we will incur. So जो आपकी एक्चुअल कॉस्ट होती है, जो आपका एक्चुअल ओवरहेड होता है, वो आप कैलकुलेट कर लेते हैं. जैसे इस फिगर में वी नो द टोटल ओवरहेड वाज 10,900, जिसमें वेरिएबल ओवरहेड आपका 6,500 था और फिक्स्ड ओवरहेड वाज 4,400. We calculated with the overhead applied, which is always based on standard hours applied. तो कि आपका $5 into 2,000 आवर्स होना चाहिए था. तो इसमें आप देखेंगे आपका टोटल ओवरहेड वेरिएंस 900 अनफेवरेबल है. इट मींस कि यू एंडेड अप पेइंग मोर इन मैन्युफैक्चरिंग ओवरहेड देन यू शुड हैव इनकर्ड. नाउ कॉजेज ऑफ मैन्युफैक्चरिंग ओवरहेड वेरिएंसेस, इसमें आपको पता होना चाहिए कि इसमें प्रोडक्शन डिपार्टमेंट के क्या रीजन थे. हो सकता है एकदम देयर वाज अ सडन इंक्रीज इन दी expenses like electricity rates. So you have to look at all the departments. Then you also have to investigate the sales department. How did they perform? Yeah, what exactly were the reasons that led to the increase in manufacturing overhead expenses? Now, how do you report variances? We can simply make a materials price variance report. We do it type of material आप करते हैं. अच्छा, what actual quantity was bought, ठीक है, what price was paid, what price should have been paid. So when you use this you get the price variance. इसी तरह for each raw material you figure out कि यार अच्छा इसकी what was the variance and what was the reason. For example जो आपने material X100 use किया उसमें the reason was for unfavorable was rush order. It was done in a haste, so you ended up paying more than what you should have paid. फिर आपका जो favorable आया it was because of a quantity discount that you were offered and you availed. फिर आपका मटेरियल A85 में the regular supplier on strike tha, the regular supplier you could not contact, you could not do business with, so you had to go with a supplier which is not regular, so you ended up paying $60 more than what you should have paid. So this is how you make the material price variance report. We can also use these variances to make the statement presentation of variances. For example, income statement, we know sales revenue, cost of goods sold. When we talk about cost of goods sold, we use the standard. What is the standard price into actual quantity? You get the cost of goods sold. So from this you get gross profit at standard. What you do, आपके जितने variance हैं, individually you list down those variance and you list their outcome, whether it is favorable, unfavorable or not, and you accordingly calculate it to get the total variance unfavorable, which you get by calculating uh, this figure, subtracting unfavorable from favorable. So you get total variance unfavorable of 3000. So the total gross profit is actual 15,000. We know the selling and administrative expense 3,000. So you come to the net income, which is 12,000. So this at the end of this lecture, I have given you all the formulas that are used when we are dealing with variance. Number one is total material variance. Through this, you calculate the total variance in the total, variation in the material, direct material. So it is actual quantity into actual price minus standard quantity into standard price. Then we have material price variance, which looks at the price aspect of direct material. Then you have material quantity variance, which look at the quantity aspect of the direct material. Same way we have for labor, and at the end we have the calculation for total overhead variance, which is actual overhead minus overhead applied at standard hours allowed. So this is the end of lecture number 30.